Welcome into MYCANEL, BRAN Decoded. Today I'm going to show you one deceptively simple, science-backed routine you can do for exactly 5 minutes that will drastically sharpen your attention and launch you into productive laser focus. If you have 5 minutes, you have what it takes. Stick with me. When people talk about improving focus, they often look for complicated strategies, long routines, or tools that promise big results. But the most reliable shift in attention often comes from something far simpler: deciding, in concrete terms, what you're going to do next. Not a vague idea, not a hopeful thought, a specific intention that your brain can act on. The moment you set a clear intention, you create a kind of neural target. Your perceptual systems, motor systems, and executive networks begin to align toward that target, almost like adjusting the lens of a camera. The image sharpens, distractions dim slightly, and the mind begins to organize itself around one direction instead of many. The reason this works so effectively is that the brain is constantly predicting and preparing for your next action. When you specify exactly what that action will be, for example, I'm going to write the first paragraph of this report in the next 20 minutes. You give the brain a precise cue to recruit the neural circuits necessary for that task. Vague statements such as, "I need to get some work done," don't produce the same alignment because there's no clear endpoint, no structure, no sensory anchor for your nervous system to organize around. But when you set an intention with specific parameters, the task, the location, and the time frame, your brain treats it as an executable plan. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning and impulse control, essentially lights up with direction rather than noise. One of the most powerful aspects of intention setting is that it reduces what's known as cognitive load, the mental friction that comes from trying to hold too many possibilities at once. When you haven't decided what to do, your brain toggles between options. Should I check my messages? Should I start the harder task? Should I look something up? That toggling burns energy, increases cortisol, and makes it far easier for distraction to sneak in. But the moment you choose, truly choose, a single path, that background chatter quiets. You're no longer negotiating with yourself. You're acting. And action is one of the most stabilizing forces for attention. There's also a dopamine component to this. When you set a specific intention, you create a small but meaningful prediction of success. Dopamine isn't just released when you achieve something. It's released when your brain anticipates a clear goal it believes it can reach. A concrete intention increases that sense of attainability, which boosts motivation and sharpens focus. Think of it as giving your brain a small reward signal before you even begin. It primes the motor circuits, increases readiness, and reduces the hesitancy that often stalls the first step. What's important here is the structure of the intention. It should be simple enough that your mind recognizes it as doable, but specific enough that it triggers action. Work on my project is too broad, but write 3 bullet points for the introduction is narrow, actionable, and neurologically digestible. Your brain understands what the first step looks like. And once a first step is clear, the barrier to starting, often the hardest part, drops dramatically. There's also a behavioral layer. When you state your intention out loud or write it down, you engage sensory pathways that reinforce the plan. Hearing your own voice say the intention or seeing it on paper strengthens the neural representation of that action. It becomes less abstract and more like a commitment. Studies have shown that intentions coupled with a clear when and where. For example, at 2 p.m. at my desk, I will outline the first chapter, significantly increase the likelihood of follow-through. That's because your brain begins to map the environment to the action, linking context to behavior. When you arrive at that environment, the plan reactivates automatically. Another key point: intentions work best when paired with constraints. If you give yourself a narrow window of time and a specific task, your brain naturally ramps up focus because it feels a sense of urgency and clarity simultaneously. Too much time or a task that's too open-ended creates mental slack. It's like trying to run without a finish line. Your pace drifts. But give your brain a finish line, even a small one, and attention sharpens as if drawn toward it. What surprises most people is how quickly this process works. A clear intention can shift your mental state within seconds. You can feel your posture change slightly, your breathing settle, your eyes fix onto an object more steadily. These physical cues aren't accidental. They're part of the brain preparing the body for directed action. The mind and body sync around the plan you've committed to. The real value of this practice builds with repetition. Each time you set and follow through on a concrete intention, you strengthen the neural circuits responsible for discipline, focus, and directed behavior. You're teaching your brain that when you choose a task, you execute. Over time, that reduces the friction of starting, increases confidence, and creates a powerful sense of internal reliability, a kind of trust in your own mind. Clear intentions aren't glamorous. They don't take long, but they are one of the most reliable levers you can pull to initiate and sustain focus. When you know exactly what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, and how long you'll do it for, your brain has no choice but to follow that signal. Clarity becomes action, and action becomes momentum. Most people assume that focus comes from forcing the mind into stillness, tightening your thoughts, or pushing harder against distraction. But the truth is far more physiological. Focus begins in the body. Specifically, it begins with the way you breathe. In just 5 minutes, targeted breathing can shift your internal state from scattered and anxious to calm, alert, and primed for deep work. This isn't about meditation or philosophy. It's about directly influencing the neural circuits that regulate arousal, stress, and cognitive control. The breath is one of the fastest levers you have over your autonomic nervous system. Every inhale increases alertness by slightly elevating heart rate. Every exhale reduces alertness by decreasing it. This rhythmic exchange is a built-in regulator that your brain pays close attention to. When you control your breathing pattern deliberately, you essentially send a strong signal to the brain about what state you want to be in, ready and focused, or relaxed and drifting. 5 minutes of structured breathing is enough time to leverage that biology and transition into a state where the mind becomes more stable, your thoughts stop scattering, and your capacity for disciplined attention increases. One pattern in particular has a powerful effect on resetting the system, the cyclic sigh. This involves taking a deep inhale through the nose, followed immediately by a second shorter inhale to fully inflate the lungs, and then releasing a long, slow exhale through the mouth. That double inhale naturally recruits tiny air sacs in the lungs that don't usually expand, which helps offload carbon dioxide more efficiently. High carbon dioxide levels can trigger feelings of stress, agitation, or mental restlessness. By lowering those levels quickly, the cyclic sigh produces a noticeable calming effect in seconds, not minutes. And when repeated for several cycles, it acts almost like a neural reset switch, lowering sympathetic activation, the branch of the nervous system responsible for the fight or flight response. Another powerful pattern is the 4-2-6 breath inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 6. The extended exhale is especially important. Longer exhales send inhibitory signals through the vagus nerve that slow heart rate and promote a state of calm alertness. Not sleepy, not drowsy, but steady and controlled. That shift in physiological arousal is what makes focused work possible. If your internal state is too elevated, you feel restless and jumpy. If it's too low, you feel lethargic. Continued structured breathing puts you in the middle zone, stable, engaged, ready. What makes targeted breathwork so effective for focus is that it doesn't just relax you, it optimizes your internal environment for cognitive performance. When your breathing is slow and deliberate, the brainstem and forebrain communicate more efficiently. Networks involved in executive function, decision-making, task switching, impulse control become more coordinated. All of this stems from changes in your respiration pattern, something you can control at any moment. During those 5 minutes, something else happens as well. Your attention becomes anchored. The simple act of following a breath pattern pulls your mind away from internal chatter and onto a predictable rhythmic cycle. Instead of drifting between thoughts, anxieties, and impulses, your mental spotlight stays on the breath. That stability is training. You're practicing the very skill you need for deep focus, redirecting attention back to a single target whenever it wanders. Each repetition strengthens that circuitry. It's like lifting weights for your prefrontal cortex, but the real value of targeted breathing comes after the 5 minutes. Once you finish, you'll notice that tasks feel less overwhelming, you're less reactive, more deliberate, and more willing to begin the work you were avoiding. The starting friction is lower because your physiological state is aligned with action instead of resistance. The body is no longer signaling stress, urgency, or scattered energy. It's signaling readiness. What people often overlook is that breath work isn't about relaxing for the sake of relaxation. It's about controlling arousal for the sake of performance. You want to land in that narrow band where you're calm enough to think clearly but alert enough to act decisively. 5 minutes of targeted breathing is one of the fastest, most reliable ways to do that. You don't need equipment. You don't need silence. You don't need a special space. You only need a few minutes of deliberate control over something the brain treats as a primary indicator of internal state. And because the breath sits at the intersection of conscious and unconscious control, practicing it builds a sense of agency. Pans. You feel less like your internal states are happening to you and more like you have influence over them. That sense of agency alone improves focus because it reduces the feeling of being overwhelmed by your own mind. When you know you can regulate your state in 5 minutes, distractions lose their power, stress loses its edge, and the mind becomes a tool you can direct, not a storm you have to survive. 5 minutes may not sound like much, but it's enough to shift your physiology, stabilize your attention, and prime your brain for the work that matters. Every time you do it, you're conditioning your nervous system to enter a state that supports deep, meaningful focus. And once you learn that skill, you can call on it anytime. Before studying, before writing, before a difficult conversation, before anything that requires your full presence, your breath becomes the switch that turns on your ability to concentrate. Using a visual anchor is one of the most direct and reliable ways to steer your brain into a state of steady, sustained focus. Most people think focus is purely mental, a matter of discipline, motivation, or willpower. But attention is fundamentally tied to vision. Wherever your eyes go, your mind follows. The visual system occupies a significant portion of the brain's real estate, and it plays a central role in how you regulate alertness, attention, and the initiation of action. So, when you deliberately direct your gaze toward a single point, you're not just controlling your eyes, you're controlling the neural networks that govern your entire state of concentration. A visual anchor is simply a fixed point that you choose to place your gaze upon. It could be a small mark on your desk, the corner of a notebook, a spot on the wall, or the edge of your computer screen. The specific object doesn't matter. What matters is that your eyes stop wandering. The wandering of the eyes is often a mirror of a wandering mind. When your gaze darts around, it increases processing demands on the brain. You're constantly re-evaluating new information, shifting attention, and reorienting spatial maps. But when your gaze stays on a single point, neural activity in the visual cortex becomes more stable, reducing internal noise. Your brain conserves energy, and that energy can then be allocated toward higher level thinking and task engagement. The moment you direct your eyes to a visual anchor, there's a downstream effect. The circuits involved in distraction become quieter. This happens because vision is tightly linked to your arousal system. A wide, scanning gaze, what you naturally use when you're stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed, signals to the brain that there's something uncertain in the environment. Your sympathetic nervous system becomes more active and cognitive control weakens. But a narrow, stable gaze sends the opposite signal. It indicates safety. It tells the brain that you're in control of your environment, which allows internal resources to shift from monitoring to focusing. This simple adjustment in eye behavior can initiate a dramatic shift in mental clarity within seconds. There's also a mechanism related to what's called covert attention. Even when your eyes are fixed on one point, your brain can still shift attention internally, but it does so more deliberately. The anchor becomes a stabilizing reference. It reduces the automatic, reflexive pulls toward distraction, the kinds of attentional shifts that happen when your eyes move without you realizing. By keeping the visual field steady, you give your prefrontal cortex more influence over where your attention goes rather than letting the environment dictate it. Choosing a visual anchor is also an effective way to prime your brain before beginning a demanding task. When you sit down to work, the first few minutes are often the most difficult because your mind hasn't yet switched into task mode. There's resistance, impatience, or internal chatter. If you take just 20 or 30 seconds to fix your gaze on a visual anchor, breathe steadily, and let the mind settle, you create a transition moment. The brain begins to shift from an externally driven mode to an internally driven one. This transition is essential because deep focus requires internal guidance. You're telling your brain what matters rather than reacting to stimuli. Another powerful dimension of using a visual anchor is how it disrupts compulsive behaviors. When your eyes start drifting toward your phone, the window, or whatever else is nearby, your brain is signaling a desire for novelty. That impulse is familiar. It's the reflexive craving for new information. But when you deliberately keep your gaze locked, you interrupt that loop. the impulse loses momentum because the visual system isn't feeding it fresh stimuli. In other words, the visual anchor acts as a barrier between you and distraction. You become less reactive, more intentional. And because the visual anchor is physical, not mental, it bypasses the limitations of willpower. You're not trying to force your mind to settle, you're letting your vision regulate the mind for you. This is one of the reasons athletes, performers, and high-pressure professionals often use a focal point before performing. It stabilizes the internal environment and prepares the brain for precise action. Over time, the repeated use of a visual anchor strengthens the neural pathways associated with sustained attention. You become better at holding focus, not because you've trained your motivation, but because you've trained the circuitry responsible for anchoring attention. This practice builds a kind of attentional endurance. You learn to enter focused states more quickly, stay in them longer, and recover from distraction faster. The visual anchor may be small, almost insignificant at first glance, but its impact is profound. By controlling your gaze, you control your internal state. By controlling your internal state, you control your ability to focus. And by controlling your ability to focus, you fundamentally change what you can accomplish. Ending any focus protocol with a tiny reward and a clear action plan may seem like a small detail, but it's one of the most powerful components of building lasting, reliable focus. The brain is fundamentally a prediction and reward system. It needs cues that signal completion, progress, and forward momentum. When you give it even a tiny reward at the end of a focused bout, something as small as a deep stretch, a sip of water, checking off a box, or a brief physical gesture, you mark the behavior as meaningful. That mark is what strengthens the neural circuits responsible for motivation, discipline, and consistent follow-through. The reward doesn't need to be big. In fact, it's better if it's small. When the reward is tiny, immediate, and directly linked to the behavior you want to reinforce, the brain associates the feeling of completion with the act of focusing. You're teaching your nervous system that steps toward your goals feel good, not overwhelming or punishing. Dopamine plays a central role here, not in the stereotypical sense of pleasure, but as the chemical that signals the brain to repeat a behavior because it led to progress. A tiny reward gives just enough dopamine to tell your brain this was worth doing. Do it again. If you consistently end your 5-minute focus priming routine with a small reward, you're essentially installing a habit loop. You begin with intention, regulate your physiology through breath and visual anchoring, and then close the loop with a reward that stamps the behavior into your nervous system. Over time, the brain begins to anticipate that reward even before you start the work. That anticipation increases motivation and reduces the resistance that normally prevents people from beginning tasks. You're shifting from a mindset of hesitation to one of readiness because the brain expects a positive outcome. But the reward is only half of the closing ritual. The action plan is the other half, and it's equally important. Once your nervous system is calm, focused, and aligned, you need to direct that energy towards something specific. A vague intention leads to scattered effort. A concrete next step directs all the physiological preparation you've built toward real action. When you tell yourself exactly what you're going to do immediately after the protocol. For example, start editing the first paragraph, outline 3 bullet points, or replay to 2 important emails. You give your brain a target. And when the brain has a target, it acts with far more efficiency. This action plan works because it removes micro decisions. Decision making is one of the biggest drains on cognitive energy. The more choices you have to make, the more friction you encounter. But when the plan is already decided, you don't waste willpower deciding what to do next. You simply transition. The brain moves seamlessly from preparation into execution. This smooth transition is critical if you want to maintain momentum. The combination of reward and action plan also builds what psychologists call agency reinforcement. That's the sense of feeling in control of your behavior, your attention, and your outcomes. When you know that you can regulate your state, initiate effort, and follow through, and when that sequence ends with a small but meaningful feeling of completion, you develop internal confidence. Focus becomes less like a battle and more like a familiar cycle your brain understands and expects. People often underestimate how powerful it is to simply acknowledge progress. Even if the actual work hasn't started yet, finishing the 5-minute routine is progress. It's a signal to the brain that you've already taken the first step. The tiny reward reinforces that sense of movement. And from a motivational standpoint, Movement is everything. The brain favors momentum. Once you feel like you're moving, you want to keep moving. That's why the reward doesn't need to be luxurious. It just needs to mark the moment so the brain recognizes it. There's also a subtle emotional component. Ending with a reward and a plan reduces the anxiety that often comes before starting a task. It shifts your internal narrative from, I have so much to do, to, I'm already in motion. Anxiety is rooted in uncertainty. Action, even tiny action, dissolves uncertainty. And because you've already primed your physiology to support focus, pairing it with a tiny reward and a plan gives you a psychological green light. Over time, these small rituals reshape your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who struggles to start work and begin seeing yourself as someone who can reliably initiate deep focus with a simple, repeatable sequence. Each tiny reward reinforces that identity. Each action plan hardwires it further. The process becomes self-perpetuating. And the beauty of this approach is that it doesn't rely on motivation. It relies on structure. Structure is dependable. Structure doesn't fluctuate with emotion. When you consistently close your focus routine with a micro reward and a defined next step, you become someone who can enter focused work states on demand. That is the real power, not just doing the work, but being able to reliably begin. Do this every time you need to begin something important, 5 minutes to decide, breathe, anchor, and go. If you commit to this small ritual before every deep work block, you'll be surprised how quickly your productivity compounds. Try it right now, set the micro goal, breathe, anchor, and launch. Thank you for watching BRAM Decoded. If you found this useful, hit like and tell me in the comments what micro goal you'll start with. And if you want, I'll post a timed version of this routine so you can follow along live.